I visited the Patricias in Gracic in north, and we arrived there the day after there was ceasefire between the Serbs and Croats, and the Patricias inserted themselves right in between them, and I got to go with them, right with them. And from there I went down to Premystin in southern Croatia to see the 1 Service Battalion, what it takes to actually bring ships in from overseas and feed 1,500 soldiers, some in the north of Croatia and some in central Bosnia. And going on those runs to central Bosnia was life-threatening, just taking in food, let alone trying to do any other military work other than that. And then I got to go on that route over the mountains into Visoko with the Lord Strathcona's horse, 12 miles north of Sarajevo. We couldn't get to Sarajevo because the road was mined. So after that, I came back to Calgary and left the newspaper business in 2000, and I did my PhD research on the Kosovo Air War. So Yugoslavia has occupied a large part of my life, whether I like it or not. You can't unsee the things that you've seen. And but what I'm here to do is, I was listening to people talk about how memories from Yugoslavia have to be stored and archived and remembered somehow. One of the things I got to do in my PhD research was do precisely that, was to talk to the pilots who were and the ground crew who were involved in the bombing campaign in Cold Lake and in Bagotville. I traveled to both places and interviewed them by email and by telephone and any other means I could for about 5 years while I was doing my research. So I think that's a little bit more important on the grander scheme of things than the Toronto Maple Leafs winning the Cup 50 years ago. The sad thing about the Kosovo War was that very few people know anything about it. And that's what prompted me to do my PhD research on it, because one of the goals of a doctoral research is to create new knowledge. And I figured, watching the news in 1999, friends of mine who were journalists in Italy trying to interview the pilots and getting nowhere. They couldn't get past 2 kilometers outside the front gates. And I'll talk about the reasons for that in a bit. I was asked if I could bring copies of this book to this presentation, in case somebody wanted to purchase it. But how do I bring 20 books up? I don't have a POS machine, so people can pay for it. And the university doesn't sell books from the U of C office anyway. But it is available through the University of Toronto Press if somebody's interested, and it is also available online for free. That's one of the things that the University of Calgary does when it publishes the books nowadays, is I have to sign agreements so everybody can read it and I don't get paid. But it's there in its entirety. As I say, I was a journalist for 25 years before I left the business to do this research, and my examination panel was adamant that it ought to be written and published in a book or 2, if possible. And that was the year 2005. It only took me another 14 years to find a publisher who wanted it. In hindsight, when I saw that Prince Harry received a $20 million cash advance for his autobiography, I wept with happiness for him. I thought it important that Scattering Chaff be published because I watched it in 2007 after 5 years of conflict in Afghanistan. That book that prominent scholars Janice Gross-Steen and Eugene Lang published in their controversial book, The Unexpected War, Canada in Kandahar. And it claimed then that the government had stumbled into a protracted combat mission in Afghanistan, which provided me stark evidence of a yawning gap in Canadian military history, because without going too much into detail of their work, they traced the government's decision-making process that resulted in a decision to deploy 800-strong Canadian battle group on the ground group in Kandahar. It was sent to fight the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in the week of September 11th, which is my birthday, by the way, and against terrorist attack in New York and Washington, and the failed attack led to the downing of 2 aircraft in Pennsylvania. Canada, Steen and Lang said, was pressured by the United Nations for ground troops. The choice that Canada made was neither the best option nor the least offensive option, because it was the only option on the table. The Kandahar deployment, this is a quote, the Kandahar deployment signaled a major political shift in political history and military thinking in Ottawa. It would be the first combat mission for the Canadian forces since the Korean War 50 years earlier. I looked in that and I thought, bullshit. Sorry, sometimes I talk like a journalist when I should be talking like an academic. I vehemently disagree with Steen and Lang. I examined the contribution to the 1990 Kosovo War that was authorized by the Liberal government by Jean Chrétien. I'm sure you probably are aware of this history, but I'll repeat it anyway. For which is not only a dedicated campaign medal struck, but there were battle honors awarded for the 441 and 425 Tactical Fighter Squadrons for their position in Operation Echo, which was the Canadian contribution to Operation Allied Force, the North Atlantic Treaty bombing campaign against Yugoslavia, Presidents Slobodan Milosevic's Serbian and paramilitary forces cleansing ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. But what did the Canadian politicians call the war right from the beginning? Outside the House of Commons on 24 March 1999, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien obfuscated regarding whether Canada was at war by asking and answering his own rhetorical question while speaking to the news media. There is an attack. Do you call that a war? It's certainly a military act which is being done to force the president of the Yugoslavia Republic to accept the Kosovo peace agreement and to settle the problem in a peaceful manner. And the next day, the Liberal government's Minister of National Defense, Art Eggleton, rose in the House of Commons to make one of the most serious political announcements any government official can, and he reported that 6 Canadian forces, CF-18 fighters, had led and participated earlier that day in NATO bombing operations against military targets in Serbia. Canada's military strategy had been quietly in place for months, but Eggleton refused to use the term war, preferring to euphemistically call it the humanitarian mission. I learned during my search that the Canadian commitment of 18 CF-18s represented less than 2% of the nearly 1,000 Allied aircraft involved in Operations Allied Force. Nonetheless, the Canadians flew nearly 10% of the bombing missions, considered the most dangerous of all flown. Bombing missions, combat air patrols, and other close air support missions amounted to more than 82% of the Canadian war effort. By the time a ceasefire was agreed on 10 June 1999, the Canadian forces had rotated the task force's personnel 3 times. Over the course of the campaign, the CF-18 pilots flew 684 combat sorties in 224 missions and flew 2,577 hours. They dropped 500,000 pounds of high explosive munitions. Of them, 171 were Mark 82 500-pound dumb bombs, 262 GBU 1,200 500-pound precision-guided bombs, and 128 GBU 10 2,000-pound precision-guided munitions. To be clear, that was almost 500,000 pounds of bombs, and the politicians called it a humanitarian mission. A very good question is, did the mission go smoothly? And the answer I got is far from it. Most of the problems had to do with the Department of National Defense budget cuts following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. In 1991, the Moroni government announced that it would be closing the Canadian Forces Air Force Base at Lahr and Baden-Soll in Germany by 1995, and reducing the Canadian Forces' overall strength from 76,000 from 82,000. In the years to follow, the finance ministers also began plucking the low-hanging fruit that was a national defense budget in the name of the peace dividend and deficit reduction. Defense spending was slashed by 23% to $9 billion in 1988-99 from $12 billion in 1993-1994. What's it today? 18, 19 billion? So you could see the difference in the inflation and what it's costing to do basically nothing in comparison. When coupled with inflation, the effect was a 30% reduction in real terms. Within a week, the Canadian Force of Preparedness for War, or rather a complete absence of preparedness, showed when the pilots identified the need for adequate combat certain rescue radios in the event someone was shot down. The solution, a general in Ottawa called his American colleagues for PRC-112 radios with internal GPS guidance systems so the pilots could be found. That general, Brigadier General David Kowski, bought 40 of them over the phone with his government credit card. That's planning. Another example was smart bombs. Smart bombs compared to dumb bombs. A dumb bomb is basically gravity. I'm sure I don't have to tell you folks here in the room about it, but they just, when a pilot just judges where a bomb is going to land when he's flying over, and gravity guides it to it. With a smart bomb, there's a laser designator, and the bomb is released, and it glides to a point where it picks up the laser and follows it to the target, which then can hit with relative precision. The smart bombs and the Nighthawk B laser designators the Canadians had 4 power magnification, which were acquired in 1997, 2 years before the mission. But the government only bought 13 of them. The magnitude of that, well, immediately upon their acquisition, 2 were taken out of usable service to be cannibalized for parts, while the remainders were allocated to Canada's 2 fighter wings for training. Looking back on what the Canadian forces were trying to achieve with their smart bomb capabilities, former 4-wing commander, retired Lieutenant Colonel Jim Donahue, did not have positive memories. He basically had 2 wings attempting to shuttle 6 or 8 pods back and forth on a recurring basis in order to try and maintain readiness levels. It was almost whimsical that it could ever be achieved. When the Canadian CF-18s were committed to the Kosovo Air War campaign, it was generally believed that 8 of those FLIR pods, the forward-looking infrared pods, were committed to Aviano, while 3 remained in Canada to train pilots who would eventually be called upon to replace the CF-18 pilots in theater. So instead of 8 in Canada, they had 3 to shuttle back and forth between Cold Lake and Bagotville to train the next cadre coming over to relieve the pilots. In the end, Canada was only to escalate the sortie commitment to using all 12 CF-18s by obtaining 4 earlier generation FLIR pods from the Australian Air Force. One of the other shortcomings with the FLIR pod the Canadians were using was its 4 power magnification. Of the FLIR pods that were available to naval militaries, the Canadians is the poor cousin variant. No other way to describe it. During the Kosovo War, the Americans were using FLIR pods with up to 8 and 10 times magnification. They also had global position systems integrated into their pods targeting systems, which allowed for precise bombing through cloud cover. In the event of cloud cover that made it impossible to deliver the bombs, the Canadians simply returned home with them. One Bagotville pilot flew 6 missions, was only able to drop his bombs once. Another issue was that although the CF-18 is an amazingly capable airplane, its mission computers, and there were 12 of them, were the equivalent of Commodore 64 computers. I owned a Commodore 64 computer when they first came out in the market in 1980s. My cell phone is light years ahead of the Commodore 84. The difference is almost incomprehensible. To put it in perspective, a modern cellular phone is 1,000,000 times faster than the processing power than the FLIR pods, than the than the Commodore mission computers, the CF-18 mission computers. This has 100,000 times more memory than a Commodore 64. Look, that was what the Canadians were fighting with. To put it bluntly, the mission computers were capable of managing the CF-18's forward-looking infrared pods, and the problems just kept getting worse. For example, at the start of the mission, the squadrons came close to, as in quotes, depleting vital consumables, according to the after-action reports. In other words, the Canadian inventories are running out of bombs. Panicking phone calls to the Canadian headquarters resulted in diplomatic exchanges with the United States and clearances to obtain 100 more GBU-12 bombs from the Americans in Aviano. So how did that end up working? That's a very good question. The clearance happened so quickly that the Canadian Forces weapons techs in Aviano, responsible for acquiring the GBU-12 bombs at a cost of $25,000 each from the Americans, had no problem at all. Giving meaning to the added expression, "don't leave home without it," he produced his government credit card. He can buy military equipment wherever I need it, wherever I can go. I call that chapter, "Don't go home without it." Don't go to war without it, sorry. Meanwhile, that was only a $2.5 million purchase on his credit card. Meanwhile, in Canada, the Deputy Chief of Defence Staff, Lieutenant General Ray Hanel, told SCONVA, the Standing Committee on Defence and Veterans Affairs, on 28 April 1999, that was the normal replenishment process. He did not say what the process only that we were replenishing or resupplying the ammunition stocks as we go along. That explanation did not even begin to come close to revealing to parliamentarians how ill-equipped the Canadians were during the bombing campaign and how reliant they were on the Americans. That was just one day. As the campaign wore on, the Canadians were back at the ammo dumps buying more bombs. One bomb technician described it this way. When we first went over there, the first ones were basically pristine looking, like they'd never been taken out of a box. But we ran out of what we had, so we had to buy more from them. And the stuff they were basically pawning off was dregs. The oldest one I saw was made in 1974, and it was really old stuff. Some of them, for me to get them to work, I had to hit them with a hammer. What happens is the little wings that steer the weapon to the target over time sitting in storage, they sort of tighten up, and the O-rings would dry up a bit. So to get it to work, you would have to whack it with a hammer. That's actually in the American technical orders to do that, and it's pretty funny, actually. Some of the stories I was told were humorous. Others were terrifying. Most of the combat missions were flown at night, and ordinarily the pilots would fly mutual defensive formations, almost like a diamond. So one was flying lead, there were two on those wings that were protecting him, and there's one in the back. Ordinarily, which was standard operating procedure. That was not the case at night, though. Despite years of arguing for them and studying them, government initiative prevented the CF-18 squadrons from acquiring night vision technology. In other words, they flew into the combat missions, they went lights out. They were flying blind. Instead of mutually defensive formations, they flew in single file, with their radars changed on the jets in front of them, quite literally so they wouldn't fly into each other. That meant their radars were incapable of detecting ground threats because they were trained on the planes in front of them. In Ottawa, General Holnot was aware of that reality, but he described it this way. I was also aware that the direction had been given to our pilots not to undertake any missions that they did not feel they could undertake given some of the equipment limitations that they had. Indeed, all of their missions were undertaken with a clear understanding that they would do the job with the equipment that they had on the aircraft to do it to the best of their ability or not do the mission. If that was the case, and to assure, as time progressed, as part of the follow-up to the Kosovo air campaign, we would inject this into the lessons learning process for the updating of the CF-18. Lieutenant Colonel Billy Flynn, who I've come to know since then, the commander of 441 Tactical Fighter Squadron, put in another less diplomatic way. In retirement, he said, and I'm going to quote it so I get it exactly right, "It was a huge fuck up." Let me use the words properly. Huge fuck up. It was incredibly stupid and typically Canadian. You know, I debated with myself about using Flynn's more colorful language, but I reasoned at a conference that included the International Woke Bastards Canada as a sponsor, they could handle it. Flynn said, "It was an incredible fiasco. That we never killed anybody is a miracle, and we had a handful, if not at least, of a dozen near misses. Nearly having guys killed on sorties, because they couldn't see anybody. And there's no ability once the war started to ramp up and use night vision goggles. I'm sure the commander of the air where we knew that we were flying with around totally blind at night as we were. It was incredibly stupid, and we could have admitted we couldn't see anything, and then we would have been pulled out of the night war. If that wasn't pressure enough, each of the pilots' targets had to be approved for their military value by Canadian military lawyers in Aviano who vetted them. Lawyers could veto missions on a target's military worth or proximity to civilians based on the CF-18's flight paths if the bombs fell short, as if the planning fail-safe with the Canadians' use of the GBAU technology. For some pilots, that vetting was a source of frustration. For others, it was a source of comfort, and for others, a source of more stress. One pilot told me, "That was something new for us, to actually have a lawyer with us in Aviano looking over the targets. Every country has a list of dedicated specific sites, religious sites, historically significant sites, and are obligated not to hire their military equipment at any one of those sites. We have to make every effort to spare those sites. The lawyers would be looking over our shoulders to make sure we were keeping that in mind, that we didn't use a bigger bomb than we had to." Another pilot said, "The pressure on each pilot when he shows up in theater to fly his first combat mission is incredible. You're not only applying pressure on yourself to deliver your weapons so you don't run away from the enemy, but you get pressure from your peers, pressure from the ground crew, pressure from the lawyers, from your leaders, and you all to go out there and to destroy your target. That pressure can make you ineffective." Yet another shortcoming of the CF-18 standard equipment not only affected Canadian operations, but those of the entire NATO coalition fleet. The whole coalition effort had to use single frequency jammable radio equipment so to accommodate the Canadians, because the CF-18s lacked jam-resistant radios. One pilot told me that the jam-resistant radios operate on multiple frequencies at the same time, so they're switching back and forth. One pilot told me anybody with a Radio Shack scanner could eventually find out what frequency we were transmitting on. If you have a really big transmitter with lots of power, you can jam out that signal frequency, making it difficult for guys to talk to. Whoever has the most powerful transmitter essentially wins. I'm serious. They were jamming us. Now, that's what I mean. There were nights when everybody thinks it's funny, but I listened to Celine Dion. It was a very poignant moment. Celine Dion, how appropriate. How did they know it was us up here tonight? With such powerful and compelling stories to tell, what Canadians have learned about the heroics of the pilots and the ground crews servicing the CF-18s, or not, from the news media during the Kosovo air war, and why. And that requires a brief departure, or glimpse back in time to 8 years earlier, a prelude, if you will. Central to the learning is what Canadian Forces personnel learned from the 1991 Persian Gulf War to understand the dynamics that shaped what the media's had, and by extensions, what Canadians writ large could know about the Kosovo bombing campaign. I watched Joy Malbon, who's a friend of mine in Aviano, interview a pilot, and it was the only pilot she could interview. And she was there for a month, standing in the field, and she actually went to all over the place trying to get permission to find someone she could talk to. When she finally did interview a pilot, the pilot had his back to her like this, and Joy was talking to you like I am. So I emailed her and I said, Joy, why did you do that? She said, I don't know, it was some kind of security problem that they had, and I didn't know but I wasn't in any position to challenge it because I wanted to interview. He was the only guy I could talk to. So I took that and I kind of filed it away in my filing cabinet, as I'm wont to do. I'm a pack rat. And so when I was interviewing people for this research to find out what they're doing for this book, I said, "What can you tell me about this security operation concern that you were trying to deal with so that you couldn't talk to journalists?" And they said, "Well, we actually learned some really important lessons from the 1991 Persian Gulf War. We learned that if the pilots were named, that families at home would face threats from people who were opposed to the war. And there were lots of them in 1991 opposed to that." And I thought, they said, if their names were identified, and they were, then, and they were in Victoria, then the pilots had body bags thrown on their lawns to intimidate them. And I thought, the wheels started turning in my head, and I thought, wait a minute, I remember that. I was in the newsroom in 1991, and I read I'll mention the Globe and Mail, because I didn't work for it, and it said that somebody had thrown a body bag on the lawn of a pilot's family, and I remember being horrified by it. So I called the base commander in Esquimalt, and I said, "What can you tell me about this body bag being thrown on the line?" He said, "Well, I don't know anything about it." So I called the police in Victoria, and I said, "Do you know anything about this body bag being thrown on the lawn? It's in the Globe and Mail today." And he said, "No, well, we've never heard anything about that." I said, "Well, it's in the Globe and Mail." He said, got me. So I didn't do anything with it in 1991 because I really wasn't in the business of fixing the Globe and Mail's mistakes. As I started interviewing with pilots in Cold Lake and Bagotville, they said, "Yeah, we learned in the 1991 that if pilots were identified, that they would throw body bags on our lawns. So we decided not to talk to journalists at all." Well, that is reason enough alone. That's reason enough to alone for nobody in Canada knowing anything at all what our pilots are doing. Who decided that? And so I called Ottawa. I tried to find out from the Department of National Defense who gave that directive. Said, "We don't know. We're just told that that's what happened." So we didn't do anything about. That's what we went with. And I thought, wait a minute. Censorship, this is censorship in every way, shape, and form. And, because I firmly believe that when journalists are doing their job right, which not everybody is in agreement with, because most people journalists don't get it right, that undermines the role in a democracy. And it was somebody in the military who gave that order, unlike the Canadian government, which declared censorship during the First World War, which is the only other time censorship has ever been declared in Canada. That is the reason that nobody knows anything about this war to this day, except the loyal readers of my book, because they'll find out what happened over there. So, you know, because I'm curious, I thought, well, I'll just go into the archives, and what I can see is there in the newspapers, in TV records of what came out of that. And so I examined the coverage of the war in its totality. I found 386 newspaper articles and TV reports. 33.4% of them had just one sentence mentioning the CF-18s. Canada has CF-18s participating in the mission. Period. That's it. One sentence. And 33 of them. 33% of it. Taken on an aggregate of 215 of them, only 55%, or more than half, had just two sentences mentioning the CF-18 pilots. Two. They were there and they were dropping bombs. Not what they hit, not what they're doing, not where they're running out of bombs, not whether they could see each other, not whether or not their radios were ineffective, not whether or not their radars were ineffective, not whether they were using Commodore 64 computers on their airplanes. Nothing. The finding that 291, or 75% of them, devoted 6 sentences to the CF-18's contribution is relevant. Not much can be learned about a war from 6 sentences or less. For that, I blame the commanders who believed the half-remembered myth from the 1999 Persian Gulf War that was the foundation of near-complete censorship of the Kosovo Air War. I know who gave that order, but there are reasons, and I'm admitting this to you, I know who gave it. There are reasons I can't tell you that. And the reasons are simple. While I was doing my PhD research for the university, I had to get clearance from the ethical clearance from the University of Calgary lawyers, which meant that they were going to I was going to have to get permission from the commanders of the soldiers and airmen and the ground crew I talked to who were in Aviano, which was fine because it was when I eventually got permission from Bill Cleland at Fort Wing in Lar and Andre Vien in Bagotville and the commander in Cleveland and Cold Lake, rather. I was required, once my PhD research was done 3 years afterwards, I had to destroy all the records. I had to destroy the tapes, and I had to destroy all the transcripts of them. When it came to writing a book, I had to go back to the original people I interviewed, so I still had all their phone numbers and emails. I had to go back to them and say, is it okay if I use what you told me in this book? That was a requirement, again, by the University of Calgary lawyers. If I wanted to get the book published, which I did, I showed everybody I talked to the transcripts. I emailed them. I was able, because wonderful computers now, you can cut and paste and put in an email and away you go. And I did that to the one officer who gave that report. And he told me that that's what he believed, the lesson that he learned from 1991. He passed that along to General Jerkowski, who passed it along to National Defense Headquarters. And as a result, the reporters were standing 2 kilometers away in the mud during the rain and not talking to the pilots. That's why nobody knows anything about that war. When I said nobody knows anything about that war, I saw people shaking their heads. That's why. I told you I would tell you why. The gentleman said, not only do I not give you permission to use what you said, but I am not surrendering my legal capability for repercussions, which meant he would sue my ass. So not only did I have the lawyers at the University of Calgary telling me what I could and couldn't do, I had and couldn't permit, I had people who were issuing the orders telling me what they would do, and they would sue me too. So even though I do know what happened, I can't tell you. And that's pretty much as far as I'm going to have to go on this. But the only thing I have to say left is, go Oilers, go.